concerning a statement by the Commission on illegal representation activities of Mr. Barroso. I'd like to give the floor first to Vice-President Katainen on behalf of the Commission.
Physically.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. President, honourable members. Unfortunately, there's not that many members around, but perhaps there are some more important issues on the agendas. But nevertheless, thank you very much for your kind invitation to participate in this very interesting and timely and important debate. I'm glad to have a chance to discuss with you on transparency practices in EU institutions, also tell about my rendezvous with my friend, former Commission President Mr. Barroso, and also correct some unintentional and also some intentional misperception concerning the meetings. So, Mr. President, honourable members, I don't think that the glass of beer between Mr. Barroso and me would merit such an attention, but I think it is good to clarify what this Commission does to meet the highest standards of transparency in general, and in particular how we decided to deal with meetings with Mr. Barroso after he accepted a position with Gomes Sachs. This Commission took a very clear commitment from the very beginning to be transparent vis-à-vis the European citizens and its actions. This is very important for this Commission and very important for me. This is why I have always paid great attention to the transparency of my meetings, and that you can consult on my website. The European Commission as a whole is fully committed to enhance transparency across all the areas of its work. Upon taking office, the Juncker Commission decided first to limit meetings between commissioners, their cabinets, the Commission Directors General, to organisations and self-employed individuals engaged in EU policy and policy implementation who are registered in the Transparency Register. Secondly, and at the same time, the Commission took a specific decision on November 2014 obliging its members to publish these meetings. Unfortunately, the same level of transparency doesn't occur in all the EU institutions. The Commission is the most transparent institution in the EU. Now, on the particular case of my meeting with Mr. Barroso on 25th of October 2017. When Mr. Barroso accepted the position with Gomes Sachs, President Juncker decided to, and announced that he would be received in the Commission in the future as a representative of an organisation. This is why a meeting with Mr. Barroso always needs to be registered, and this is exactly what I did here. I told my cabinet to publish the meeting on my website in the section dedicated to meetings with organisations and self-employed individuals engaged in EU policy making and policy implementation. The Commission decision of November 2014 provides for the publication of the names of the organisation, not of the names of individual persons representing the organisation. This is why I published the meeting with Gomes Sachs. Some of you are interested in details of the meeting, so I'm happy to clarify this. The meeting was set up at Mr. Barroso's request in his personal capacity and not as a representative of the organisation. And it was all arranged over the phone by my office. I met him in the bar of the Silke Perlamon Hotel for a beer. Mr. Barroso and I were the only persons present at this meeting. I consider José Manuel Barroso as a friend. I worked a lot with him when he was the President of the European Commission, and I was the Finance Minister and Prime Minister of my country at the time. We worked together through one of the most difficult periods in Europe's recent history, during the economic and financial crisis. For about 4 months, I was Vice President in his Commission in 2014, during his second mandate. In spring 2016, before he accepted a position with Goldman Sachs, I visited the United States. During my visit, I spoke at the University of Princeton, where Mr. Barroso was a lecturer and held a faculty, and he was kindly enough to organize an event with the students to discuss about Europe. Mr. Barroso and I were also at the same time panel at the Atlantic Council event during my visit. So when he proposed to have a cup of coffee, I suggested going for a beer instead. My office took care of setting up the time and place of the meeting. If he had not contacted me, I would have contacted him, because I had already for a long time thought that it would be nice to see him again. When we met, it was me doing the most of the talking. I told him about our ambitious trade and defence agenda. He is a lecturing professor and travelling a lot and meeting world leaders, so I thought it is useful for him to know that Europe is on move again. And I hope he would spread the word. I also spoke to him about the future of Europe discussion, which many of you is familiar with. Of course, we discussed politics, life and personal matters, as many people do when they are sitting with their friends. Our meeting was respecting in full the rules the Commission has adopted. The Commission has never said that Mr. Barroso could not have meetings with members of the Commission and that members of the Commission would not be allowed to have meetings with him. The meeting was made in public with the rules and with the commitment taken by President Juncker. Had I not made this meeting public, I could understand the questions. But do not criticise the Commission for having made the meeting public, because this is the request we are imposing on ourselves. We all have a right to have private life. We all have a right to select our friends. I could not imagine myself politicising other people's friendships. The NGOs who have had questions have received answers from the European Commission, and those who still have questions will also get answers. So it is in this spirit of transparency that I am discussing here with you today. Thank you very much.
Noi, domnule vicepreședinte.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Let me now give the floor to Mr. Rangel. 1.5 minutes, please.
Senhor Presidente, Senhor
President, Mr. Katainen, well, let me begin by thanking you for the clear and sober manner in which you've described your meeting. I think the way you dealt with that shows a certain level of respect for the Parliament. I mean, I think holding this debate here today is actually more reality show-esque, I think, than the kind of discussion we should have in a Parliament. Now, Mr. Barroso was President of the Commission. He served 2 terms of office, and then he returned to private life. And there is nothing that we can reproach him for in terms of ethics or behaviour. Now, perhaps there is some kind of personal vendetta being carried out here. Perhaps he has enemies. Perhaps there are people in this Parliament who didn't like his political line. And as a result of that, every time he appears, every speech he gives, every time he does something that's completely normal for a person to do in their private lives, he gets attacks from this Parliament. I mean, we've got the Manafort scandal emerging, we've got high-level officials from the Commission involved in the Ukraine scandal, and at the time when all of this is happening, we're busy discussing whether Mr. Barroso should have met a friend of his in a bar in Brussels. I mean, I really don't think that respects those who have served the European Union in a respectful manner. Mrs. Gomes, now 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much. We've heard that the meeting between Mr. Barroso and Mr. Katainen is a no subject. Of course, there are lobby activities, and of course, there's the question of whether his capacity in Goldman Sachs are commensurate with the previous capacity as being President of the Commission. But the Vice President of Mr. Katainen met him, knew that that was not a good idea given the controversy that cropped up when Mr. Barroso was appointed a consultant for Goldman Sachs.
and we've heard that a meeting with Goldman Sachs, that he's met Goldman Sachs and met Mr. Barroso, but hasn't put that in the register, and then said that you talked about defence, but President Juncker didn't say that. It wasn't just taking a glass of beer together. So there seem to be all sorts of contradictions, and now things are coming to light which we didn't hear about before. And we'd like to know what sort of topics of foreign policy and defence policy you discussed with Mr. Barroso, a representative of Goldman Sachs.
Thank you.
Mrs. Harkin, 1 minute.
I believe in listening to both sides of the story, but any explanation must have real credibility. First, your meeting is logged in the register as a meeting with Goldman Sachs, yet you said it was a meeting between friends. You say Mr. Juncker said that it's a rule that any meeting with Mr. Barroso has to be logged, so why not by name? Secondly, we had the sorry saga of Barroso's hasty exit from the Commission to Goldman Sachs, a company that carries at least some responsibility for the crash where millions of EU citizens' lives were damaged or destroyed. You cannot ignore that fact, and at any meeting logged in the Transparency Register, you are a Commissioner first and a friend of Barroso's second. The golden circle of powerful interests and powerful people meeting with no account of proceedings does not have the confidence of EU citizens, and no matter how you explain it, your meeting with Barroso falls into that category.
Domnul de Jong, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. de Jong. 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also thanks to the Vice President to be here. I'm very happy that we talk about transparency and we share the interest of the Commission in transparency, but I must say the more I listen to the Vice President, the more confused I'm getting. You enter into the register, rightfully so, that you meet a lobbyist. That's also the policy of the Commission, that Mr. Barroso is only treated as lobbyist, not as friend, not as beer drinker, nothing like that, just a lobbyist. Then you say, but we had a chat. And of course, this wasn't about Goldman Sachs. I wrote it down in the register, Goldman Sachs, but it wasn't about Goldman Sachs. It was about a university background, trade and defence, and the European Union. I mean, this is all very contradictory. And I really think that we deserve, as Parliament, to know exactly, was he there in his capacity as lobbyist for Goldman Sachs? Then he also has a problem with the Commission, because the ad hoc committee, ethical committee, made very clear that his commitment not to lobby for Goldman Sachs with people like you was important for the committee to take this decision not to take sanctions against Mr. Barroso. So I think we need far more clarity than you've given, and at this hour it's quite normal that the people who are spokespersons for their groups are here and not the entire Parliament. So thank you very much.
Mulțumim. Domnul Gig.
Thank you. Let me now give the floor to Mr. Giegold, 1 minute.
Commissar Katainen.
Commissioner Katainen, I have to say candidly that when it comes to the transparency of meetings in the Commission goes a lot further than what we do here in Parliament. It's a lot more than what the Member States do. Transparency concerning the meetings between main officials and you as Commissioners, that really constitutes progress in terms of lobby transparency. And lobbying transparency has never been to prevent contacts between friends. That's of course not what it's about. The actual problem though that we're talking about here is how you can see somebody change sides, like Mr. Barroso going to Goldman Sachs. How did that happen? And unfortunately, you missed an opportunity to carry out a far-reaching reform to prevent this sort of thing from happening. You basically tinkered with the rules to a degree on the fringes, and what we're still lacking is an independent ethics committee that would be able to decide on these issues, and that would not be appointed by the Commission, but would actually come from independent individuals. So please draw the lessons from that particular narrative to change these rules so that they're democratically friendly. Thank you.
Bon, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Le Breton. Now, 1 minute.
Merci, Monsieur le.
Thank you, Mr. President. The former President of the Commission, Mr. Barroso, was recruited in 2016 by Goldman Sachs. Sadly, famous for causing the 2008 financial crisis. Officially, he was not recruited for lobbying purpose. Difficult to believe, but the Ethics Committee in the Commission said just about that. In other words, simply close ranks, given the attacks. But he was surprised in a conversation with Mr. Katainen, and the spectre of lobbying rears its head once again, and saying that this is simply talking to a friend is not convincing. And Europe, the banks, business people, what we really need is one which respects nations and people's freedoms. Thank you very much.
Doamna Beres, un minut.
Thank you, Mrs. Beres. Now 1 minute. Vice President, I mean, you talked about transparency, but my impression is actually that you've been muddying the waters. I mean, you talked about transparency and having a coffee with a friend. I mean, who is this friend, though? I mean, you are a Vice President of the Commission, so you should be asking yourselves questions about the kinds of meetings and contact that you're having with Mr. Barroso, who is an employee of Goldman Sachs, to provide advice on Brexit. I mean, what were you talking about? Trade and defence. I mean, tell me there's no link between the two, Mr. Barroso's job in Goldman Sachs and the issues that you've admitted raising with him. I mean, you may well have just been having a beer, but that doesn't change anything. I mean, you've basically gone far too far when it comes to the minimum rules that the Commission has in place when it comes to lobbying carried out by Mr. Barroso, who now works for Goldman Sachs.
La procedura Catch the Eye.
Thank you. We now move on to Catch the Eye. 4 colleagues on the list. Firstly, Mr. Denano.
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, President. I know that promises are only really important for those who believe in them. But Mr. Barroso said he would not intervene on behalf of his new employer, Goldman Sachs. And some of us, that a former President of the Commission, should not get into revolving door business so soon after leaving office. Having a beer with a friend who happens to be a Vice President of the Commission, where you talk business. And we demand transparency in dealings with lobbyists. Like most of my colleagues, I publish all the meetings I have in the context of my duties. We have a duty to tell the truth. Mr. Katainen, I am you as Mr. Denano, myself as well. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Marias. Thank you very much, President. The recruitment of Barroso by Goldman Sachs caused an outcry in public opinion in Europe. Now it seems he lobbies for Goldman Sachs at a time when he said that would never be the case. And this again causes outrage in public opinion, and that's the main thing. Mr. Katainen has given answers to the questions. I think he created more questions than actually answers for what actually happened. Had this been a private conversation, there would have been no need for it to be for the meeting with Goldman Sachs to be recorded. It could simply have been described as a meeting with Mr. Barroso. And I think that something has happened, and it must be put right. To discuss defence, that it doesn't seem to me to be very convincing. Does Goldman Sachs take an interest when it comes to defence stocks and shares in defence companies? Do you have anything you can tell us on that question?
Mrs. Morvai.
Thank you. Now, I sympathize with poor young people or not so young people who protest corruption in Hungary waving the flag of the EU. That's pathetic, because we actually see what is happening in the EU. This is a typical story. Here we have Mr. Barroso, a former Commission President, his mandate is over, he has all his political relationships intact, he signs up to Goldman Sachs, one of those companies, banks eminently responsible for ruining the lives of millions of EU citizens. And then he comes back time and time again to lobby on behalf of Goldman Sachs, meeting old chums. So let's not wave the flag of the EU if we are serious about getting rid of corruption, because this is not a place you come to learn how to get rid of corruption. I hate corruption, but we are certainly not going to take lessons from the EU.
Rog pe domnul vicepreședinte Katainen.
Thank you. Let me give the floor back to Vice-President Katainen.
Mrs. Schlein.
Mrs. Schlein.
Sorry.
Grazie Presidente. Grazie
Thank you, President. Vice-President Katainen, there are some contradictions, I think, in your explanations to this Parliament and therefore to European citizens. The meeting with Barroso violates commitments that you'd taken on. I mean, it's already bad enough that someone who had the honour of serving as President of the Commission became a lobbyist to the Commission itself. But we want to see transparency and independence, and that means avoiding any possible conflict of interest. I mean, I want to know exactly what you talk about. We have a challenge, which is reducing the gap between citizens and our institutions, and this is part of it. Transparency measures are crucial to ensure we know which interests are being represented in our corridors. It seems that your institution listens more to big business than to our citizens with all their problems. Thank you.
For real.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question. First, I would like to answer Madam Gomes' question, what were the topics of defence and foreign policy related issues which we discussed. I'm sure you know most of them, so I explained what we are doing or what we are planning to do with the Defence Industrial Fund, how we have established preparatory action on defence research, also about the latest development on PESCO, etc. On trade agenda, I explained or listed all the countries with whom we are negotiating and things like that. So because I'm in charge of these issues, I'm interested in these issues, and it tells a lot that things are moving to positive direction in Europe. So those MEPs who are involved in these files, you know more or less the substance what I discussed about. Then a couple of other remarks. I understand that people have controversial thinking regarding the Goldman Sachs as an financial institutions. Everybody has right to have negative or positive or neutral position on this. Also, some people may have some attitude or opinion on Mr. Barroso. But I think we all can agree here that transparency, as Mr. Kiegold said, transparency doesn't mean that it denies people to meet each other. So it's allowed, of course, for commissioners, just like whoever, to meet, for instance, Mr. Barroso. He cannot be the only person in globe who cannot be met. I'm sure that many of you can understand that a person who I know from many years back, who I consider as a friend, who has a wide view on how the world is moving, it's just natural to discuss with him, have a meeting with him, just like whoever meets him. If I invited him to my home with my wife, as a group of other friends, I don't expect anybody ask me to invite Commission official to sit in the dining room corner and record what we are discussing. Madam Perez, if I could continue. So there's nothing more than just a normal discussion. I have personally never received, I checked today from my website, I have never received anybody from Goldman Sachs. I wouldn't have problem to meet Goldman Sachs if they had something to tell. A couple of my cabinet members have received once or two times members from or representative of Goldman Sachs, like they meet all the other financial institutions or NGOs or labor unions or industrial organizations who are interested to meet with us. So regardless of or taking into account all the controversies around this topic, in my mind, friendship also matters. I understand that everybody does not consider friendship similarly as I do. It's not a matter which is relative to public debate. Friendship has its own value. And I do hope that we all see things like that. I will meet Mr. Barroso next time, I don't know when, but hopefully hopefully soon enough. We see each other very rarely nowadays because he's traveling, I'm busy, but hopefully I have a chance to meet him again. And I will do exactly the same what I did this time. I will disclose this meeting because we have a principle on this. Even if it's a private meeting. So I will do the same as I did this time. Mr. Barroso has followed all the rules of Commission and his personal commitments. He has not lobbied Commission. So I don't know, but I'm sure that everybody here always discloses your contacts every time when you meet somebody and you make notes on these discussions. It's a good principle, because we need to do whatever it takes to strengthen confidence of our citizens towards the political decision making. And even, I mean, in this House, it's very important because you are the real decision makers together with the Council. So thank you very much for this discussion. I'm always available if you want to continue this particular discussion or discuss on the other issues. Thank you very much.
Mulțumim și noi, domnule vicepreședinte. Cu aceasta dezbaterea este închisă.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And the debate is now.
Thank you very much. The debate is